Good morning. Just so everyone is aware, this training will be recorded. If you're uncomfortable, please feel free to turn your cameras off for the duration of the presentation. I think we're ready to start. Good morning and welcome to Advancing the Agenda FASD Training with Donna Debolt. Before we begin, I just want to make participants aware if you or someone in your household is in crisis, please reach out to your local crisis service. We will put St. Leonard's Crisis Service contact information in the chat. We are thrilled that this training has reached caregivers, educators, and community partners from across the province, who all play important roles in the lives of those living with FASD. To introduce myself, I am Lindsay Campbell, and I am one of two FASD coordinators here at Contact Brant. I would like to also introduce my colleague and counterpart, Linda McFadden. I want to thank you all for participating in today's training to expand your own insight, knowledge, and awareness around FASD. I encourage you to take what you learned from this presentation to build capacity within your community and recognize the need for collaboration between all those involved when supporting a person with FASD. I want to thank Contact Brant, who made this training and future training opportunities possible. In terms of housekeeping, I will go over some brief reminders. Please ensure your mics are turned off for the duration of the training, except for when there are opportunities for asking questions. When asking questions, please use the raising hand function and speak over the microphone or use the chat feature, and I will ask these questions on your behalf to Donna. At approximately 10:30, we will take a short break. I will also send out the recording of today's presentation to the email address you registered with on Eventbrite. At this time, I will kindly ask Linda to lead us in a land acknowledgement.
So we are grateful that the land on which we live and work lies on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. Acknowledging the land is a sign of respect and recognition for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. It also provides an awareness of Indigenous land rights, their beliefs, and honors them as original occupants of the land. As an organization in the Brant community and as individuals who benefit from living and working on this land, we have a responsibility to continuously educate ourselves and recognize that colonialism is a current and ongoing process. We need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Our work does not start and end with land acknowledgements. We want to recognize and celebrate the Indigenous communities that we have the opportunity to work with and learn from, and pay our respect to elders both past and present. So just before handing things over to our presenter this morning, Donna Debolt, I just wanted to quickly recognize that Donna is joining us from Edmonton, Alberta, this morning, where she is a social worker in private practice. I just wanted to highlight that Donna has translated her 30+ years of work in child protection to become an outspoken advocate for children, youth, and adults with FASD. So if you're good to go, Donna, I'm going to pass things on to you.
I am good to go. Thank you for all of that. The introduction. The only thing that Linda missed in who am I am in Alberta, and it's 7 a.m. So I just want a little bit of kindness and support that comes from the fact that I'm drinking a bucket of coffee here, trying to be present, although it's very easy for me to be present for FASD. I'm hoping Linda and Lindsay both talked about the chat room and asking questions, and I'm really hoping for that. I think that the strength of Zoom is that you get to stay home, you get to drink your own coffee, you get to stay in your own pajamas or whatever it is you care to wear, but the weakness is that it feels not as intimate as face-to-face training. So if we try to give this some effort in the right direction, so it feels like a face-to-face training, I would love your comments, and I would absolutely welcome your questions as well. So with that, I will get started. When we decided that this session would be called Advancing the Agenda, there's really, I think, interest and importance in sort of taking the basic premise that FASD is a lifelong disability and that it has consequences in a full body experience. But of course, we talk a lot about what does that mean for the brain. But I really want everyone to consider, having known that, is what does that mean? What is the developmental trajectory of FASD, and what do we need to do to support that, and how do we work in the best way possible? My experience with this started when I was a supervisor manager in child protection, and believe it or not, it was probably about 1988, but I have formal memory from 1990. So when they say over 30 years of child welfare, it's actually more 44 years of child welfare and 33 years now of direct FASD work. What I recognized in that period of time doing the work that I was doing is that these kids were very common to our practice. Didn't quite understand what that meant, but very common. I knew that it was very expensive, because that's what brought my attention to this, is that the service delivery continuum was asking for a lot of money to do very important work. And I also understood very quickly that it was really complicated. And the more I looked at this disability, the more complicated it became. It did not, you know, have an open laneway and sort of, if this happens, then you do this, and then things will get better. And that was the complication, I think, of FASD. At that time, I outreached in my own practice. In those days, there was no email or internet, and I just approached the University of Washington people that were so good at this, and developed now a professional long relationship with some of the team there. And it was Dr. Sterling Claren who ended up coming to Alberta, to Lethbridge at that time, for a conference that was initially supposed to pay the bills if we could get 150 people together. And what happened in 1993 was that we ended up having 750 people come. We kept having to change venues. And that told us all how important this issue is, and how pervasive it was, and how important it was to gather and to understand what this disability was about. Dr. Claren, who I don't think I would have my practice if it wasn't for him, was really clear with me on so many levels about how is this going to get better? How are we going to have better information? How is best practice going to be common practice? And he said that what we needed to do was a couple of things. We needed to provide a pathway to professionals where they looked like they couldn't do their job if they didn't understand FASD. We needed to create professional, you know, he called it kind of professional jealousy. In other words, how come you know this and I don't? I better get my knowledge base up to snuff. But he also said, and I think this is probably the one thing that landed with me with the biggest thud, was he said that FASD is a disability that's going to force us to cooperate with each other. In other words, it's not just the family, it's not just the school, it's not just the service agencies in the community, and it's certainly not just the individual with this disability. And so he said, when we have this in fact, he went farther. I'm going to quote him, I think, directly. He said that he thinks that these kids were put on this planet, these individuals with this disability were put on this planet to force us to cooperate. It's what he said. So I think that is important, and the story of FASD is important. So if you're sitting here and you work, you know, in the community sector, you have an experience with this, and then you have to look at your practice and say, how common is FASD within the people that I serve? I just recently did a case consultation for a young man who's in care, and the child welfare worker that was responsible for his care really knew very little about this disability. And my concern about that is that she's directing and impacting the kind of work, and I might reference this case a little bit today because it's front and center for me, but she's really setting the tone for the intervention and for the work for this boy. And not knowing much about FASD, or being confused about its core values for intervention, means that she may make some mistakes in doing that. So the story is important. My history and what brought me here today is important, and everybody in the on the session this morning has a reason for attending. And if you're a caregiver, I'm grateful for you every day. And I absolutely know that my most prevalent core value in doing my work is that I understand the absolute imperative nature of having stable placement. And we'll talk about that a little bit because you can't have a session about FASD and not talk about how do we keep them where we put them. And I don't mean any disrespect to the thems there. It's just an efficient way to say that. And so when we pay attention to placement stability, then that means the service that we give is to those principles. If you work in the community sector in terms of family support and family work, then I'm also here to tell you that you have a responsibility to make sure that the placement stable at home, the placement stable at school, the placement stable in the workplace or in the day program kind of way. And there's ways to look at that. And so that's the important part of this. All right. So that's my preamble. I think I'd like to start, if we can, in looking at, just so we have a foundation of this work as we go through today, is that the best definition I can give you about fetal alcohol syndrome is that it's a disability of thinking. When you consider that, that means that, and I joke about writing a book someday that I have the title of it, but I've never done any of the work to put it between the title and the back page. But my title would be FASD, The Life of Misunderstands, because we misunderstand them and they misunderstand us. And when we kind of look at the principles of misunderstanding, it means that we often look at individuals with this disability as being way more capable than they are. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that they don't have strengths and they don't have gifts and they aren't, and that we shouldn't pay attention to those. I'm just saying that many, many times those gifts aren't available to them because of the challenges of being understood in terms of their disability. So when you always look more capable than you are, and you would rather be in trouble than look like you need help, we end up with the challenges that we often see. When I do work in the adult sector, if I ask one question of them, to the, so what could we have done for this individual in their developing years to adulthood? The number one answer, and it's an unrelenting, important consideration, is that they wish that their adults that they're trying to serve would accept support. And so what we have built often with individuals with this disability is a sense that that not needing help was the community value and accepting support was weakness. I joke with anyone who wants to listen to my recent issues is I have 91-year-old parents, and I say the same thing about them, is who didn't teach them that getting help was a good thing, and not needing help was not strength. So we have work to do around some of the principles of independence, and we can talk about some of those things as we kind of move along today. But when you would rather be in trouble than look like you don't know, that comes to the issue of the central nervous system complications and, all of those that are rather hidden. And everybody on the screen probably knows all of that, and I'm not going to go through it. But when we're talking about that, then we have to appreciate the fact that it's the environment's job to create the outcomes. And so, and I'm sure you've heard this saying before, but I'm going to toss it at your way again, which is it's important to be the thermostat and not the thermometer. And in fact, we set the tone for what's important and what's not. I think that when we're looking at this very predictable developmental trajectory, and how complex and variable it can be for everybody, what we also have to appreciate is that there's a lot of commonness with that. And, there's a really lovely saying in the FASD world, which is, if you've met one person with an FASD, you've met one person. And I have to agree, of course. But I also recognize in my practice that there's a lot of commonness, and I can know very little about somebody and talk about what the past and current and future challenges and strengths might be with respect to that person based on their presenting disability. So when there's a predictable developmental trajectory, it means that we have to come at that anticipating and seeing what's there. Okay, so when we have this sort of age on one side, age and expectations on one side, which is a kind of a viewpoint I often use, and we start from on the age from birth to adulthood, is that the typical developmental trajectory of expectations goes like this. It just goes straight up, and we know that by 18 there's a commonness about expectation. And what do we want at 18? We know that they need to be able to manage their time, money, relationship, hygiene, and schedules. And what do we know about most individuals with this disability at 18 is every one of those things is hard. And then we have to measure from there, how far behind are they? Where can expectations be? I just recently did a case consultation on a 14-year-old boy whose expectations in life are very much tied to his chronological age. And what got presented to me with every experience of his behavioral fallout was that he is very, very typically 7, 8, or 9, depending on what you're asking in any given day for him to do. So they're in trouble every day when the expectations are here and his ability to function is here. I often in my practice call that the mad factor. How mad is everybody at how this is going? Is that part of it? There's also a lovely kind of, well, I don't know if it's lovely or not, but there's a saying that expectations are just future resentments, and I think that we have to kind of decide as we're moving this along, whether that's exactly how we want to work with expectations at FASD. So the very first part of this predictable developmental trajectory that I want to talk about is kind of the dysmaturity of FASD. And I think the lived experience of most people, if you're caring for or working in the field of FASD, is exactly that. I don't think we would have much variation, in that theme to say, no, this person has an FASD, they're 15, and they are meeting expectations of 15-year-olds. That's just unheard of. And the challenge, of course, is that children become adults, and adults come with their own set of expectations to manage what I've already put out there as societal expectations around managing your time and money, relationship, hygiene, and schedules. And so then we have to look at, is the fallout of their non-compliance really non-competence? And that seems to be the theme in most of my work, is moving people from seeing something as non-compliance to seeing it as non-competency. So when you have dysmaturity, then the fallout of that is that you're going to look like you don't fit. And when you talk to individuals with this disability, and I'm hoping there's some of them maybe on the call this morning, is that they feel very badly when people feel like they're not carrying their own weight, acting grown up, doing what's expected. And the truth about that is that they will eventually get there with support. For example, just so that I'm not just talking in the abstract here, if you're going to teach them how to budget, I'm going to suggest you might be really disappointed in the long-term outcome of something like that. But if you teach them to accept support to their money and talk about who can help you with this and how is it that you can have what you need, a roof over your head, warm clothes on your back, and food in your belly. How do we get there? is a much different, you know, tone of work than let's teach you how to budget. And that seems to be, again, not the part of this work. So what I'm trying to also encourage here, I think at 7 something in the morning, is that what I'm talking about is that we need to be referencing function, not behavior. And when we talk about the behavioral fallout of FASD or the behaviors of FASD, you're not going to see that word in any of my work, because what I tend to do when people send me assessments is when they start to use the word behavior in any of the assessment material, I usually take a red pen and cross out behavior and put function, and then I try to read it, because then it makes a lot more sense to me than when we talk about behavior. And I think that's mostly, and we also have behavior consultants, and we have people who look at behavior, and people talk rightly that behavior is communication, and sure, we are paying attention. But I think in the work of FASD, when we reference behavior through the word function, we end up with much better answers to the challenges and to the need for support. Is this making any sense? I would love to hear from the group. I'm going to practice what I preach, which is give me a moment to sip my coffee. And any chats at all, Linda?
Not so
Sorry, no
far.
chat, yeah.
It's making
Okay.
a lot of sense to me. I appreciate all the content so far.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. All right, are we ready to go? I really would love your feedback, because I feel like I'm in a bit of a vacuum here doing this. Let's talk about protective factors just for a moment. If we know that this predictable developmental trajectory has consequences, because the expectations placed on the child, the youth, the adult are probably unreasonable given the developmental, you know, measured developmental outcomes of the individual, then we have to say, well, what helps? I think that we will get to, as we go through the morning a little bit, we'll really talk about, you know, what is informed care, and I'm getting there a bit with what I'm suggesting. We need to be really okay with the term assertive outreach. It's an interesting term that's used mostly in mental health that we've kind of brought into, you know, the FASD work. Just looking for my my note about, you know, why assertive outreach, and what are the other words. When you say assertive, people think, you know, you're bullying, you're pushing, you're you know, maneuvering, but really what we're talking about with assertive outreach is we're getting in front of. We are supporting before there's an issue, because what everyone in the work of FASD intervention has to understand is that if you crisis manage, that's all you're ever going to do is crisis manage. You are going to not have time or resources, both money and physical resources, to do anything else but as I like to say, clean up on aisle 8. So crisis management means we're doing the wrong thing. So how do we get in front of crisis is through the work of assertive outreach. So an example of that in the mental health field is that many years ago, you know, they would have to navigate and I'm taking it out of the FASD world so you can have a sense of that this isn't just a term that is used with us in our work, but is that with somebody who had schizophrenia, they would have to navigate every day about taking medication to keep them well and to keep them supported. And that was, you know, that was a challenge. What they have now got the benefit of is that they can have a medication once a month, which means we're only navigating the whole medication decision monthly instead of daily, and that's a good example of assertive outreach. So how do we get in front of them? How do we make sure that we have you know, the supports that are necessary before they need them, that we build an environment where they get what they need? My experience with caregiving is that it happens and you don't even know it. I have been around tables with parents, and the school said, so do they need any help with their morning routine or something? And the parent will say, no, they're really good with that. And then I have to say, okay, let's look at that. What do you do to make sure they're really good at that? And then you get to hear the day-to-day stepping that they do to make sure that that child is successful and gets out the door in the morning. But it was a 40-point program. It wasn't they handle it, it's okay. And so sometimes we do things, we build environments that work for them without even understanding that we have done that. So this informed care, assertive outreach, the idea that, and I even use terms in my practice, we have, and I'm sure you've heard them before, but the whole idea of helicoptering and snow plowing. And I'm putting these principles out in front of us so that we can reference them later. But helicopter is the stuff that probably doesn't matter. We will be around, we'll be doing some supervision. But if something really matters, if it's really important to the outcome for the family and for the child or the adult, we need to snowplow that. We need to get in front of that and make sure it happens. And that's the difference. When we hand things back to the individual to manage themselves without any clear reference that we better make sure that they're feeling successful, that's where the challenges start. Okay.
Donna, can I jump in there? I just see our chat
Please.
has a few things. So someone is asking, sorry, I lost it there. Would it be a good way to describe to teachers that a child would rather be in trouble than appear to not know what they're doing? Other people are chiming in about it's the hardest thing to convince educators and other support people that the expectations are way above their abilities. And how do we get schools and doctors on board?
Well, we have to persist. I think most of it's training. I think I have some things I say back to educators when they're insisting. I think when you pay attention to the systemic challenges is that, our educational system was built, probably 150 years ago when we put 6-year-olds together, and then we put 7-year-olds together, and we put 8-year-olds together. And we understood that didn't work very well all the time, but that was the system. And we put them in classrooms with, depending on where you live, between 20 and 35 kids together, and we operate that. And there was a time years ago that if you couldn't do math, then you failed and you were held back, and that was a big deal. How many times have you failed? And kids with developmental disabilities and kids with cognitive challenges were failed all the time. And so the system looked at that and said, well, we're going to look at this from a fail and a pass, and we're going to keep kids moving. We're going to keep them with their peer group. And so there's real solid core values. And if you're a caregiver and you've ever tried to let your 8-year-old have another year in grade 3 or grade 2, they probably lost their mind on you, because they have been so well, sort of challenged around previous practice where that didn't work either. And so this whole developmental understanding of kids and how are we going to place them where they should be is really poorly understood. And it's really challenging systems to say, why can't they be where they fit? Why can't we have, a system that can respond to this? I'm a real fan of multi-age groups of kids, and so that it doesn't look like, so I have a whole viewpoint of how the educational system can run, but they probably have a really good viewpoint of how the child welfare system should run. So we're probably good to go here. But the keeping kids where they fit is really important. Let me give you a specific example. We have in Ontario, I'll go to because I'm familiar with your system, kids with developmental disabilities can stay in school till they're 21. So they're actually giving 3 more years of formal public education to kids with developmental challenges. which is a wonderful thing. I'm going to tell you, we don't have that in Alberta. Before pandemic, they were looking at it, and it kind of died on the pandemic table. But it also died on the pandemic table because they invited me to be part of some of the the conversation. And one of the challenges was, very specifically, is that I was trying to get them to say, could we not use those extra years, those extra months? Could we not use those all the way along with the child's developmental experience? So why couldn't we use one of those 3 years in kindergarten? Or why couldn't we say, gee, grade 4 went really well, let's do that again to solidify skills and to give this kid a real sense of competency? Why can't we use it in grade 4 or grade 7 or grade, like whenever we decide to use it? But what's happening in 90% of the time, excuse me, in Ontario is that they're using all of that time in high school. And anybody who understands this disability know that foundational skills and the kids are most available for intervention in those early years. And so early year practice, so that we get to do it over and over and over again, because the best magic elixir to having problems with thinking and processing is that you have good habits. And how do you get a habit? Is you do the same things in the same order with the same cues and prompts every day. And so when you have a habit, you don't have to think. And if you don't have to think, you're going to have better outcomes. And now I'm not saying they don't think. Of course they think. But I'm trying to create, or we're trying to create, or systems are trying to create environments where these kids fit. And they're offered things they can do. And so the school system and they're trying. I give most of them complete credit. I was part of an experience earlier this year. I was meeting, and the principal was part of that. I think he was afraid I was coming in and I was going to spend a lot of his money by ordering all kinds of stuff. And I was trying to describe what this boy, who was in, I think, grade 5 and had many needs that hadn't been addressed, and he was developing some really bad habits. He was falling apart on a regular basis, which only makes sense. If you're being asked to do things you can't do, you have two choices: you fall apart or you take off. That's it. That's all you got, especially if you don't have to have any skills around negotiation and putting yourselves in the shoes of another person and doing all of those higher ordered brain functions. And so I'm sitting there with trying to organize a program for this boy. And I could see that the principal was getting madder and madder at me. He was getting redder and redder and redder. And he finally, said, "What do you want me to do, Donna, with this kid? What do you want me to do? You want me to put him in some back room somewhere and educate him there?" And I said, "Yeah, now we're talking. He can't manage his group." Right? He's told you that from kindergarten, that it's too much for him. So how are we going to manage his program, his school needs, his stuff off the backs of, of the information we already have? And so he threw that out. I know he did, because we had a chance to talk later, but he threw that out because he thought a social worker's not going to ask for these kids to not be with their group. And yes, the social worker was asking for this boy not to be with his group. He couldn't cope. Everything about how his day ran. So why I'm using that as an experience to share isn't that there's something to learn from that. It's just that everybody is looking at FASD from the point of typical, predictable, regular kind of practice. And what often has to happen for individuals with this disabilities, we have to really think differently, is how do we give them a day they can use, and what does that look like? So schools are doing their own grief and loss about this, and you have to look at the prevalence of FASD in their school. Do they respect that? Do they understand what good practice would be for this? What we tend to come at them with are all the expectations that may or may not work. I'm always amazed, I guess maybe the word, that we think the answer for kids with an FASD is to have one-on-one support. My experience sometimes is that, not all the time, but sometimes, is that one-on-one support is too much. It's too intrusive. It's it's very intrusive, and so kids sometimes push back against that kind of support. So we have to sometimes, how do we create environmental supports where that one-on-one pressure is not necessarily there? So the answer isn't always with educational assistance. It is sometimes. Sometimes there's safety issues. Sometimes there's other things, but it's not the answer often for learning that we think it is. So I'm wondering if that answered, or if there's some fallout of that, Lindsay. Can you see?
Seeing any new questions, but someone did make a comment that they find educators feel they do need to make a lot of accommodations for one student and that they don't have the support to implement this. There's challenges in getting them on board with making the accommodations for the entire class, so it will benefit all and will in turn be less work for the educator.
Right. And I think that we spend a lot of time in my practice when I was doing a lot of training of frontline people. I had an experience in my car where a gravel truck backed into my car and dumped a load of gravel on top of my car. Now I was not hurt, but it was a mess, and my car was pretty damaged. And the poor gravel truck driver got out of his truck and came over to my very damaged car and started sweeping the gravel off the hood of my car. And I by this time I'm out of my car, and I said to him, I don't think that's helping. Like, I don't think it's the gravel on top of my car that's the problem. And that analogy has, kind of served me well, because we do a lot of sweeping gravel in systems of support. We do things that don't count. And this boy in grade 5, for example, often sent to the principal's office, and then the principal thought, well, I have to be a principal, and so I will lecture and moralize and talk to him about what he did, and we'll talk about what can he do next, and how can he prevent being upsetting to his classroom environment, blah blah blah. And I think I've convinced him that when he gets sent to the office, which he still needs to be done, because whatever going on in the classroom needs to be broken up, but he's wasting his time with this boy when he comes into the office. And so I think I've convinced him that he can play checkers with him for 5 minutes. If he's got no time for him, that's also fine. Let him sit there and have some entertainment. But if they see that as punishment, it really needs to be seen as respite for the teacher. And so when you reframe how all that works, and I have experienced in the past where that's worked really well, and where kids have even said, I think I need to leave. And when teachers say, sure, let's look at this, it works so much better. And so it's permission sometimes to stop doing the stuff you think you need to do on behalf of the child, and really look at, how do I serve the environment? And that is the hardest part in FASD work, is not, it's certainly child-centered when you do that, but it's really, the answers are with the environment. And so the answers here with the teacher who's not coping very well, and probably putting expectations on the child to regulate and to stop and to get organized and to participate and all of those things, when what he needs is a break, and what she needs is him not to be there. Then what happens next with the principal doesn't need to happen. And I hope that's, if we were in the same room together, there'd be nodding heads and there'd be some consensus with that. But let me, many years ago, I had was asked to do a teachers I do many teachers conventions, and so I'm very familiar. My best friend's an educator, and I brought her along in the FASD world, so I'm very familiar with teachers. I think every friend I had as a child became a teacher or a principal. So I'm part of teacher talk all the time with what I do. So I think I have I'm certainly not a teacher, but I certainly have a pretty good, thumb on what's going on. And when we put together in this invitation to do teachers, they always want their education about anything to happen, in a in a Thursday afternoon meeting after school when everybody's tired. They'll give it half an hour, they'll give it 45 minutes. Can I come in and do this and do that? So these teachers' convention sessions this was kind of long. It was 75 minutes. So I had an hour and 15 minutes to tell 200 teachers that were in the room about FASD. And I was really nervous about it this first go round because I thought, I don't want to say things that are going to make them dangerous. I needed to do something that was going to inform. And so as a consequence to that, I came up with this 3 C's that if you know me, you know I've not done nothing but talk about this since. So I want to kind of put those out there for those of you who haven't heard me before. And those of you have, I know you've heard this because I don't think I do a session without talking about this. But I want to reference it here so that we have some understanding when I talk about non-competence and non-compliance and all of those pieces, where that comes from. So if you look at the way the world works, we have connection. We work really hard on connection. Social workers call it building rapport. We have key workers. We have kind of one-on-one supports. I joke with schools that, you know, their connection is September. There's not a teacher out there who isn't saying, well, I'm getting to know them and they're getting to know me. And once we know each other, then the next step will come, which is how do we create compliance? How do I get them to come along? Now, the word compliance sometimes sets people off because it sounds pretty top down. So if you're not comfortable with the word compliance, I use it because everyone talks to me about non-compliance. So I feel very comfortable in using the word compliance. But if that word irritates you, then a good substitute C word is cooperation. So once you have a relationship, you expect cooperation. And once you have cooperation, then we can build skills. But to keep in the C theme, I'm calling those competencies. So we believe in our work that if we have connection, we will have compliance or cooperation. And once we have that, we can teach skills, competencies. And that's how everybody approaches most things. And people talk about engagement and I absolutely believe that relationship is important. I just know, and every parent on the call this morning knows, that these kids do many things in spite of the fact that they're connected. So what I have come to appreciate is that if we're looking at intervention that works for individuals with an FASD, we have to start at the bottom. We have to give them a day they can use. We can and educators have to understand that might mean that we underplay cards. There may be some some potential left on the table because we're giving them a day they actually can use and will come along with. And once we give them the day they can use, they will be increasingly more cooperative or compliant. And once they're cooperative and compliant, we know they can be in relationship. And so in my family work, I often hear people say, well, you know, if he loved us, he wouldn't steal from us. If he loved us, he'd come home. If he cared about this program, he'd get here for 9 o'clock when the program starts. And if he really wanted to be in the school, he would be here. And my point to all of that is that you can only have those expectations if they can do what we're asking them to do. So we start every bit of intervention looking at the competency, and every time we see non-compliance, we have to see that as non-competency. And what happens for me, and this is my, you know, I know they have an FASD, but and people give me the but, and when I hear the but, I know that's the grief and loss of the system or the people. But you know, we have to really sometimes, you know, come down to understanding that they, you know, that some days they just can't do what they did yesterday, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so how do we take them on their day? And how do we make decisions about intervention? And how do we just wait it out sometimes? And that's why in the neurodevelopmental world, they need more time, they need more practice, they need more experiences, that were, and not different experiences, more experiences where they can be successful. And we build on that. And so back to my other conversation about retention and placement in school and expectations, is that's why if they've had a bad year at school, it just didn't work from a curriculum point of view, with a teacher point of view, with a peer point of view, whatever was going on, let's not repeat that. But if they've had a great year, let's look at saying, can we do that again? Can we make this child, make this individual feel like they can be really successful? So giving them skills they can use and making sure that we do that every day. And it's little nuanced things. I had a teacher very recently say, you know, this kid, when she gives him work she knows he can do, he says it's boring. And I tried my best to convince her, and I think I might have done that, that what he's saying by boring is, I don't know how to get this started. Okay, so starting and stopping is really hard for individuals in FASD. And so and that's why transitions are hard. Transitions mean every time something changes that they have to think, and they have to organize, and they have to get things done. And I'm telling you, have told you today already, that thinking and processing is an integral part of their disability. So we have to be careful and not seeing that, you know, the transitional challenges aren't about the same things. It's about thinking. And if you think about thinking and you think about changes, you have to recognize that that we're asking them to do a lot of different things. So when you're moving from system to system, when you're, you know, from being awake to, or being asleep to being awake, from being awake to being sleeping, from the dinner table to the play zone, from, you know, this to that, all of that requires thinking and organizing. And so how do we support that? And how do we create habits around that so that it's not as much work for people watching? Okay. So does that make some sense, the connection, compliance, competency? What are people thinking about that?
I can jump in with questions too, if we don't have
Sure.
further
No,
comment on that.
I'm good.
I think you did answer this, but I will just ask it. So someone's asking for some concrete examples of environmental supports, and another person is talking about school is a big one right now, that accommodations are being made. However, the youth has to ask for those anytime they're struggling. So how do we convince support teams to move in?
Okay, one at a time there, I think. If the youth is part of the answer, they have to initiate their program, that we know it will fail. And so, you know, the idea that you know what you need and you're going to ask for it, when it comes to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, is kind of ridiculous. They may ask for it, but not in the way we're expecting to have it be asked for. And so what was the concrete questions about? What was the first part, Lindsay?
Just giving some concrete examples of environmental supports. I think you have spoken about it, but is there any suggestions?
Well, I think that the, you know, and again, it's so child specific and environment specific that I'm afraid to kind of go off script here a little bit. But when you start back to say, like in a consult I did yesterday, is when this child has a good day, what does that look like? So the answers have to be, you know, specific to that, because once we know that they can have a good day, and we also appreciate that the fact that the good day happened because the environment got it right, and when there's a bad day, the environment got it wrong. Now, I'm not naive enough to believe there's not a little of both of those things going on most of the time, but it's really hard. This is my best answer to that question, I think, is that when I'm sitting with, you know, in consultation, because half of my practice is training and half of it's consultation. And when I'm sitting in consultation and someone starts the consult by saying, well, you know, Sam's doing really well. I always stop, because that's my best teaching opportunity, to say, well, no, he's not, but you are. And then they always push back. No, 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 he's really doing well. And I go, well, that's fine, but he's doing well because you are. And it's such a different thinking from a teacher perspective. And just like parents, they don't even realize how much accommodation or how much support and again, this is very specific to the child and their individual needs. So it's hard for me to, to pull what would that look like. It's giving them more time. It's giving them an opportunity. I have a little guy right now in kindergarten, and they finally have admitted that it's okay in circle time on the carpet, that he's not quite seated. They've given that up. And so if he's not making a lot of noise, they're happy with that. That's an accommodation to the environment. So how they see success has really changed. And so we have to come at this knowing that when things are going well, it's us. And when things are going poorly, it's us. And the answers aren't with them more cooperating. There's three words that I, and it comes from school, it comes from community service, it comes from family sometimes. But the beware of words that tell me that people really aren't understanding this disability. The first one is that they're not motivated, that they don't, and I've heard it very recently with a kid who has some addiction, use, probably not addiction, but some use issues, is that he's not really motivated to behave differently. And I just think everybody on the screen should know that motivation doesn't exist for any of us. If you look at the new brain research about motivation, is that the only thing that motivates us is to start. So if you're waiting to clean out your garage, you're waiting for the motivation to do that, I'm here to tell you it's not coming. How you get that done is one box at a time, or just open the door and see what's in there. That's probably, how you're going to get something done. And so when we look at the whole idea of motivation, we're in trouble with FASD. It's certainly not available to most of us, and really not available to them. They don't have to want it. We don't have to wait for them to want it in order to create outcomes. The other word that really kind of distresses me, there's a few of them, but is the word manipulation. So I hear it all the time, how manipulative they are. And I just want you to know, I wish they could be manipulative. It gets us what we need, is to be able to read the room, see it from someone else's point of view, know what other people need to hear, make systems work for you. If those are the definitions, and they sort of are, then I get that every day. My life is very ordered, and it works for me every day. So am I manipulating that? Am I able to manage that? Why systems use the word manipulation? And I have an assessment here on my desk. I can see the red lines here from where I'm sitting. But this assessment says that this boy's manipulating maybe 6 or 7 times in 4 or 5 pages. And that tells me lots of stuff. When you think someone's manipulating you, what you end up doing is not offering service. You back right off. You abandoned until they come along. And so anytime anyone assesses that someone's manipulative, you are going to stop supporting. And that's why it's such a dangerous word and such a dangerous feeling. And these kids can look manipulative. I'm not going to suggest you don't feel manipulated by them. They're going to change their story 4 or 5 times. They're going to decide you need to hear something totally different. They're going to try and get things done, and it's going to be really awkward and not useful. And it's not going to have the finesse we would hope it would have. And so it's going to look that way. But it's a dangerous word with FASD because it backs off the service delivery. We don't help people who are manipulating. Okay. And the other word that I'm not as fussed about, but I kind of worry about a bit, is enabling. And the definition of enabling is doing for people when they can do for themselves. And we worry about that so much in service delivery, and I don't quite understand that. If serving and supporting is helping, then we have to be okay with that, and not, again, if you feel like you're enabling someone to whatever, it's often, especially in the adult world, it's often translated to support. I still work for them, an agency who's got a huge population here in Edmonton of adults with disabilities. They now have, according to their own report, probably a third of their client base has an FASD. And when I first got to work with them, they had two kind of policy rules. One of them was that they couldn't drive anybody anywhere, and they couldn't buy anybody coffee. And everything I know about adults with FASD means both of those things need to be part of the intervention experience. And so that had to change really quickly if they wanted to do that. That's how they feel supported, and that's how we have, as most people would know, how that would look. So I don't know, again, if that answers the question specifically. I should write some of these down, Lindsay.
Someone's just asking for another word you would recommend instead of manipulation.
Well, I just wouldn't use it. I mean, if you're trying to describe their sort of desperation at trying to get the world to cooperate with them, I might say that. They're desperately trying to get the world to, to deal with me differently. And I think that, from a functional perspective, sitting and we do a lot of talking. This was an experience, and again, back to, what I've been trying to put out before, but there was a big conversation about this young man, a young child in elementary school, not a young man, he's a boy. And the fact that a male EA last year had the most success. I think he ran through 6 or 7 of them. I wasn't part of anything last year, but I think he ran through a few of them. But the conversation around the table was that he did much better with this one guy. And they were saying, maybe it's the physicality, and maybe it's the it's the gender alignment here, that they had some things in common. And I got to tell you that I suggested to them that perhaps what I understand about men, maybe a little bit more than I should, given that I have one in my life and a son and 3 grandsons, is they talk less. And so if you've got a disability of thinking and language doesn't serve you very well, I was trying to get them to say, maybe the reason that this man did well with him from an EA perspective is he wasn't chatting it up with him all the time. He wasn't, telling him what to do. He wasn't on him constantly with language and explanation and the rest of the story. There's an old adage in FASD, which is our job to explain them to the world, not our job to explain the world to them. And I think it has some relevance here. And so that's not really another word that you can use, but it certainly is the thinking that needs to be behind that word. Okay, I just don't think it serves anybody any purpose. And when it's there, if the person asking the question has a direct experience with this, with the word being used, I'd be happy to answer that more fully. Okay.
There's just a couple other comments talking about transitions and how difficult those can be. Things as simple, I'll use air quotes, as getting up in the morning, going to bed. It's such a struggle. Another person is saying that having parents understand this can be difficult due to the grief and loss, and understand that learned skills may be forgotten each day, but they liked your term mad factor.
Okay. Just in transition, and then they tucked in there the whole issue of sleep. Please know that it seems to be one of the more, pervasive issues with FASD is sleep. Most individuals with this disability have trouble getting to sleep. Most of them have trouble staying asleep. Most of them have trouble getting up in the morning. And that circadian rhythm of the brain that kind of tells you, I need rest and I've had enough rest and I'm done, and it works for you or it doesn't work for you. And certainly other things, hormones and everything else plays a role in that. But these kids, it really seems to be a challenge. And so how do we get kids up in the morning? How do you transition from being asleep to being awake? Is huge effort. And I think the legitimacy of understanding that's a big deal means that we have to pay attention. I use an example because I think it's a pretty good one of many years ago, training a whole group who had gotten some funding to do an employment program for individuals in FASD between the ages of 16 and 24. And it was a lovely bunch of money. And they were going to get these kids fitting into community and into employment in a lovely way. And they wanted to be trained. If they're going to do FASD work, they needed to be trained. And so in I go. And they had already done their policy and practice manual. And I had said, let me look at this after it was all over. I said, let me see it. And they sent it to me. It was 87 pages long. I thought it might be 4 or 5 pages long. I kind of got to page 4 or 5. And in there, it said the program was going to start at 9 and end at 4. And I knew right away that they didn't do any FASD accommodation of adolescents or young adults. Because if they had, then they would understand that 9 is not useful. They needed to have a program that started noonish with probably a meal-ish of some food-ish so that they would get them there-ish. And then they could run a program from that point of view. But starting at 9, they were going to have, right off the bat, they were going to have non-compliance. They were going to have people not there. They were going to have some chaos in their early morning programming. Schools often operate their most academic, classes first thing in the morning. They'll do language arts, they'll do math, they'll do science, they'll do everything. And then the easier, and I'm using air quotes, but the things that are a little more flexible from a curriculum point of view are in the afternoon. And many of our kids with an FASD aren't ready. Their brains aren't ready post-sleep. For that kind of expectation. Now, that's not all kids. I want to be really clear. But that whole idea of how do we transition is it takes time, it takes effort. I have a mom getting an adolescent up, and she starts the process 2 hours before this child needs to be up. So gone are the days you go in and open their door at 7 a.m., flip on a light or open a drape and say, we're leaving in half an hour. That just doesn't happen for this child. So she starts, has a very deliberate set of actions to get this kid, out the door. And it takes a lot of time. It's part of it's a big part of her day. It's not just a little offside. It's a big part of her day. And she also has permission from the school that he's not late and he's not punished because she's in charge of getting him there. And it's really hard for her to get him there. That's part of it, very well explained through his disability lens. It's not, wouldn't it be nice if all adolescents could sleep till they wanted to? It's not part of that. He has a very solid assessment that says these are all problems. So, typical adolescents, of course, would also like to sleep till, whenever. And wouldn't it be nice if all of our programs started in the afternoon? But the truth about this disability is that requires accommodation, and that has to be part of the conversation. In FASD work, we have, what do we know about this disability? And then we have to go to the next kind of level of putting, a plan together, which is, what does all that mean? And so when you look at it, has trouble sleeping, has trouble getting up in the morning, what that means is that there's going to look like some non-compliance, but it's really non-competency around arriving on time, depending on what the expectations are. And then we have to say, well, how do we accommodate that? What are we going to do about it? So we seem to miss that middle part in planning. We know what we know about this disability, but we don't think about what that means before we shoot off, what are we going to do about that? There was a situation very recently with a young man who has trouble. We've talked a little bit about stopping and starting, and he doesn't really know when he's full. They've looked at it medically. He does not have Prader-Willi or other disability related, because that can happen too. But he can't stop eating when he starts. And he often doesn't know. So he overeats. He is overweight. They were describing that he's gained 100 pounds in the last 3 years. He's in middle adolescence. And the answer that they thought they had was for him to meet with a dietitian and understand portion size, and that he needed a trainer. Okay, I'm not going to judge right now because somebody on the air might on the screen might know this case. But it's nonsense that they've handed his problems with stopping and starting eating to him. You need some environmental supports here to make sure that he's not going to be immobilized by his weight, which he's very close to being. When his brain is already unreliable to him, now his body is going to be unreliable to him. And so we have some pretty good work to do here. And the answers aren't typical. If you have a typically developing 16-year-old who's overeating and gaining weight, yeah, maybe a dietitian and maybe a membership at the gym and maybe all that. But when you've got a child with a developmental disability that's been well measured and well understood, handing that to him makes absolutely no sense. That's kind of it's professional malpractice, actually, to expect that that was going to be useful. And it's, after the break, we'll start talking about how do we collaborate and how do we see this from the same point of view. We all need to be in on this. And so the answers for him are how do we build an environment where he's moving more? And so, so whoever's driving him anyway parks a long way from where they're going. You're not taking him to the gym, but you're going to get him to walk farther. And at school, you're going to make sure that he's going somewhere on the other side of the building a couple of times a day just to get movement. And we have to sort of maneuver our way so that he has fewer choices about how much he eats and when he stops and all of those, because he can't do that. And I'm hoping that's making some sense to you, that the answers aren't with him, they're with us. But if you look at this 3 C's, connection, compliance, competency, what you also appreciate is that to make him feel like he's doing okay, probably with weight, I wouldn't do that. But you're going to, when these kids have a good day, you're going to give them full credit for that. You're going to say, my goodness, look at what a good day you had. This is terrific. And meanwhile, you're wiping the sweat from your brow because you worked so hard to make sure that that happened. The analogy I often use in training is sort of like baking cookies with a 3-year-old, which is you absolutely do that. And you give the 3-year-old full credit for the wonderful outcome. And they serve the family and you look at the cookies, child made, isn't this wonderful? But you absolutely understand that the only reason that worked out is because you were there, that you made sure it happened. And the reason we make them feel capable is so that they will cooperate and that they will be in relationship with people. And so that core value of doing this. And so for this boy, first of all, I want to take weight off the table here because nobody's going to be saying to him, gee, you look great. And, gee, have you lost weight? We're not playing that game. We're taking this right off the table. We're just doing our work. But in other parts of his life, we can talk about how quick he was from one part of the building to the other. And that was wonderful. You must have moved very fast. Good for you. And I'm making stuff up because I don't have the direct experience for this, but I think we have to get really, really good at making sure that we see it through that lens. Anything else?
I did know that Ruth had her hand up. I don't know if she wants to speak now.
Hi, yes, I did have a question. Thank you. As a parent, what I've noticed that sometimes you outgrow some of the supports that people already know, the people that are helping you, so counselors and so forth. So how do you as a parent, for instance, I had a counselor and the counselor was saying that I was enabling my child. And then I was thinking to myself, right at that moment, I was like, then you really don't understand my child. And I didn't know what to do at that point. So do you have any suggestions around when a parent outgrows maybe some of the services or the services that are being recommended? Like, how do we move forward, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, a really good comment. I think, I don't know what you say back to somebody who doesn't understand the disability. I would go back to, why is the child seeing this person, right? I would go back, you go back, Ruth, to that, why is the child going? What was the purpose of this, this level of support? But if somebody said to me as a caregiver, now I want to tell you that parents that have children with these disabilities can look like they're enabling and can look like they're too involved. But so if it was her response to you really tells me that she doesn't know a lot about this disability. Does that make sense? So what I might have said back to it, first of all, I would have thought, do I need this service? But what I also would have said to her is, tell me what you mean by enabling.
I did ask that, but I think what the response that I got back was, I have to exercise my child's brain and make them think for themselves. And I was like, but that's contradicting to all of the early years that I learned. So now we're in adolescence. We're very consistent with, his routine, my child's routine and X, Y, and Z. And it's been like that for a long time. However, and he's doing great. So to me, it's working because he's doing great. But I just feel like, okay, like I went into this service for a specific thing that was for him at now. But I didn't get what he needed for now. Like we're still not moving past where we're the issue, right? The learning, the what's next to come, right? We're not passing it. It's like we're figuring that out and creating systems ourselves,
right?
Rather than me getting it from the professional, if that makes sense.
Well, that's happening for you, and I don't know who these people are. I don't know who this person is, and I'm going to be really careful here, except for that I'm not. Is that when you don't understand this disability, and when we come back after the break and we talk about how do we cooperate with each other so that we, have best service, what are the kind of the core values of that? Is that whatever your child was referred to this person for, if they haven't made the gains that you wished for that. And I'm going to tell you that kids with these disabilities, kids and adults, they like the relationships, like they like to go, they like the conversation. But we have to really say, are we spending the right money in the right way to get the outcomes that we absolutely need? And if she sees your management of the environment as too intrusive, let me tell you, these kids are thinking. I don't know how you stop the thinking. My conversation about understanding that the disability is in thinking is so that we get the fact that what they're challenged with is taking the information in. They're challenged with organizing that information in terms of where do I put it. They're challenged with making sense of it so they can use it later. And when all of those things are hard, then the idea that he's going to come up with a better solution to how his morning routine would work might be there. We might have to pay attention to that. But the truth is that his morning routine that is probably come in as an example to, he doesn't have to do much thinking about it because you're not changing it very much, is going to serve him very well for a really long time.
Thank you very much.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And here's when you look at parents, this is this is the I've experienced it on the professional side and I've experienced it by listening to parents. But when you have the whole child welfare psychology, we look at the impact parents are having on kids. We absolutely understand that. That makes a ton of sense to everybody. If you have if you come home tonight and it's dark and you see a little 3 or 4 year old riding his bike down the street, you don't look at that 3 or 4 year old and say, what's wrong with you? You look at that 3 or 4 year old and say, what's wrong with your parents? Like, where are they? How come this is going on? So the world evaluates the impact adults are having on kids, which is what your what this person has done for you, Ruth. They've said, you know, you're too intrusive. You've got to let this kid have some, you know, some flexibility of thinking and thought and organization. And there's going to be some things that I'm sure you say, I don't care about that. I don't care what shirt he wears. I don't care what this, but there are things that matter. And that's the difference between helicoptering and snow plowing, that you're snow plowing in the morning so that, and we're just using that as the example, so that he gets out on time. But the other part of that kind of scenario is that when you've got a child with a developmental disability, there's an impact that the caregivers feel. So not only is there an impact that the child gets from the caregiving, but there's an impact that the child with a disability, what impact do they have on the caregivers? I mean, I meet caregivers all the time who say to me, I wish you'd known me before I had these kids because I didn't look like this, right? And I didn't behave this way, and this isn't how I thought I'd be a parent, but this is what works. And so it's not coming naturally. I mean, I suppose we could line up and ask for parents who like routine and don't like flexibility, and organize it so that they can get children who need that. But it doesn't happen that way. So many times parents are working off script, that they would rather their child make their own way. And I expect, Ruth, that's where you're coming from with this child. You just know that you can't, and it gets hard. And the other thing you probably know, and it's hard to explain, is that when you change the rules for kids with an FASD, it's instantly the new rule. So you don't get to try things out very well. You don't get to say, let's see how it works for you to come home from school on your own, or let's see how it works when you are responsible for your own business, because then it becomes the new rule. And that's the struggle. I mean, the best part, you know, I'm a parent and a grandparent, and I'm telling you, the best part of all of that is that you get to break the rules sometimes when you have kids. You know, it's a snow day and you never eat in the living room, but you've covered the couch and you're having pizza and a fire and a movie in the living room because it's a snow day. And how lovely is that to have that family experience? Except for every parent on the screen today knows that if you do that once, that child with this disability thinks that's the new rule, and that they can eat pizza in the living room anytime they like. And that's the struggle, is that there is no flexibility in caregiving to the stuff that counts. There is stuff that doesn't matter, and you get to have a ton of flexibility with that. And that's what makes it easier or better, I guess, for lack of a better descriptor. Anything else? How does that sound?
Coming in. I don't know if I have a number of questions. I don't want to know if we want to get a few in before the break.
Yeah, let's do that. And then we'll.
Okay. So first person, which you did touch on a bit, is asking, does diet have any effect on the mood or focus of a kid with FASD?
Oh, it does on everybody. So yes, the answer is, of course. I don't think there's any magic other than good nutrition. I absolutely think from an evidence point of view that there's no evidence that certain foods and certain things and certain way of managing is helpful. It's just good food, of course, and given in, you know, routine kind of ways. There are many kids, you know, with this disability. I give you the experience of a child who starts eating and can't stop, but I also know there's many experiences where kids, you know, come home every day with an uneaten lunch, and you know, with that they're, you know, we have adults who can go a couple of days without eating, and because nobody is helping with that, it's you know, they aren't getting started. So that's would be my very brief answer to probably a little more complicated response.
The next question sort of focuses on non-compliance and feeling confused of how we get other people on board with that. Parents are feeling up against the wall due to lack of knowledge or education around FASD.
Right. It is you know, that the whole sense of non-compliance is that when you see that through a behavioral lens and not a functional lens, then we're going to have the wrong answers in intervention. That's the problem. And you know, I think everybody on the screen understands that, well, I hope you do, that I have witnessed in my practice, and I see many, many people over the years, and over 33 years for sure, there's quite a number, is I've never met an individual with this disability who has benefited from consequences. So they can talk about them, they know what they are, but they haven't benefited from that. So many times when we see non-compliance through a non-compliance lens, it comes with a warning, it comes with a consequence, it comes with what's following that. And none of that's going to be motivating, you know, to the systems. It's not going to, and I'm using a word I shouldn't use, but it's not going to be useful to the system around that. And how do we explain it to other people? Is we just keep at it. We just see, you know, that it's they just don't have it. And if we have the attitude that these kids are going to be part of an experience that they can use, you're going to see that. You're going to see when they can't do something, you're going to see that. You got to give up and move on, right? You try and move on. And that's the labor intensive stuff that I think that schools and families are very aware of, is how much effort it takes to sometimes move the agenda.
Okay, two more. I don't know how quick these are going to be, but do you have any suggestions for housing for an older youth or a young adult with FASD? It seems that most housing programs are not supportive.
Yeah, you know, housing is an interesting, there's been lots of conversation about how do we secure housing. Housing is placement, right? And certainly I just did a conference last spring, and the whole focus was on housing and homelessness, which is not even a term that, you know, is kind of is used, the insecure kind of placement of people. What I need people to understand, and it's maybe not the experience of the person asking the question, but many individuals with FASD have been homeless since infancy. So when you are 13 or 14, as this boy was that I did a consult last week on, and he's already had 11 placements in that, you know, in that period of time. What do you think that's going to look like in adulthood? So the whole construct around how do we see stable placement is it doesn't just start when you need housing as an adult. It starts as you need placement all the way along. And so when I work with adult service agencies that do housing, is that they need to see it as more than a roof. It needs to be understood that there needs to be housing support. That is, you know, how do you make sure that the rent is paid? How do we make sure that they don't bring, you know, 40 kids into or 40 people into their, you know, how do they, you know, not bring pets in when they can't? How do they keep food from spoiling? How do they keep the place clean? How do we, so the whole angle of how do we create housing options for young people needs to take into mind that, first of all, they have the dysmaturity. So we're actually often housing 18, 19, 20-year-olds that are really functioning 11 or 12. And I don't know how many 11 and 12-year-olds are living independently. And I don't think you could advertise for that and get a good response. And so the whole construct around how do we create housing support needs to understand that it's full care in many levels. I had a young man that they finally reasonably housed him. He came from the child welfare system, was homeless for a period of time, finally got him into a place, and then realized after a couple of months that he wasn't living there, that he didn't go. And when they finally kind of tracked him down again, this is an assertive outreach kind of program that was falling behind their obligation a little bit, I'll say that. But when they finally met up with him, he forgot where his place was, and he no longer had keys. So simple housing is not simple housing, right? They thought they just needed to get him a place and away he would go, and it didn't happen that way. So again, don't know if that answers the question, but we need to be really specific with agencies that do housing for adults with these kind of disabilities around what we mean by support. What does that look like? And And I don't know that a lot of people completely agree with me, but I'm going to tell you that I've also never met an individual with an FASD who can manage their own money ever. And so sometimes when we manage money for them, it supports housing and it supports food and it supports all kinds of things. I'm not saying they don't get money. They get money that doesn't matter for sure, but we don't give them the rent and we don't give them the food money because otherwise they'll be hungry and homeless. And so the idea that adults can all manage their own money, money is vulnerability when you have FASD. It's not money for me is kind of power and influence. I get to make choices. That's a lovely consequence of being a grown-up is you have your money. But when you have an FASD, money tends to be a vulnerability and not a consequence. So those I'm talking about those things because they go together. If you can't manage your money, you can't have housing. If you can't manage your money, you're going to be hungry. If you can't manage your money, you won't have what you want. You're not going to have the skateboard or the specific shirt or the so what we have to sell to do this right is we have to say the business case of having support to your money is that you get what you need. And then you can use other things. You can say things like, well, Connor McDavid doesn't manage any of his own money either. So, he has an agent. So you need an agent. And so we can soft pedal it. We can make, useful dependence look very useful if we use the right words. If we use the wrong words, it's going to sound like you're useless. You can't do this. If I don't do it for you, you're just going to make mistakes and there's going to be a problem. That never works. It never works.
I have one final question, I think, before we go into break.
Okay.
It's really just speaking to caregiver burnout. Do you have any advice for parents? Because this is really hard.
Well, the whole issue of caregiver burnout is almost a Canadian issue. I think we're feeling it across the country with caregiving to children and caregiving to people with disabilities, caregiving to people with dementia. I mean, it goes on and on. So caregiving is really being challenged in the mental health field for sure. And there are consequences for doing this work. And that's why I said what I said about that mom who said, I wish you'd known me before I had these kids because I didn't look like this, is what she was describing is burnout, is, this has changed me and I don't like how it's changed me. But how we support that, and I'm pretty clear around, and I haven't said it but once, and we've been in here for an hour and a half. So, but the whole idea of placement stability, it requires 4 things. And how burnout helps is by us recognizing that. And it's training, and more training than you think you need. And if you sitting here this morning saying to yourself, I already knew this, she said nothing new, oh my goodness, I've just wasted my time. I'm here to tell you that's a good thing. To feel confident enough in what this disability means that you are bored by the information is a good thing. It's reinforcing. It's really a magic elixir to feeling burnt out is knowing. The next thing everybody needs is coaching. And there are service providers probably on this call this morning that do that. But there's many ways to get coaching. It can be family, it can be professional, it can be, many different variations to how do we remember what we know. And I do that inadvertently for people sometimes in things. I reinforce what they already know. And so that's what coaching is about. You've got it, is what I say. You know this stuff. You don't need to. I just had a mom not long ago call me about, in that vein, chiropractics for her child for sleeping because she had read that it helps. And I'm just quiet on the call and she's given me the whole thing. And I don't say anything back to her. And then she stops and says, oh, Donna, I know. That's ridiculous. This isn't, I'm looking for a solution. It is absolutely a problem without solution, probably. We can cope, we can work around it, we can help, but it's not going to be easily fixed. And so she did it herself. She's telling me, oh, I think this would work. And she just stopped because I didn't say anything back. That's coaching. I helped her remember what she knows. And that's part of burnout, is when you start to get these crazy ideas about what would be helpful. The third thing everybody needs, and this is critically important, probably a big part of our research that I did with Dr. Dorothy Baudry was around the need for everybody to have respite. Respite means you have a planned and orderly break, a step away from this. And I'm not here to tell you how to do that. Just like I wouldn't tell you, lights and candles and get in a bath. I don't know what that means for you. I don't know how often. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know. What I do know is many caregivers say that it's too much work when they come back or when I come back or whatever the answers were. So I don't do it. That's nonsense. First of all, we have to teach these kids that it's going to take more than just you to raise them. And that's a good thing, because they're going to need more of that going forward. That's not going away. But the other thing is that you need respite. It's very important. And up against respite, and I was going to do this after the break, but I'm doing it now. We'll have a little later break, is that we need to have a relief plan. So everybody feeling the burnout of care needs to have a plan about what are we going to do when we can't take another step. What happens in typical placement is that when it gets to that, the placement's usually over. Whatever the placement means, is the child, has to leave, has to go to another place, has to go. And the truth about that is, if we don't see that as temporary and we see that as permanent, that's how these kids get 11 placements, is because people reached an end, reached a position, and they probably didn't have training, they probably didn't have coaching, and they probably didn't have respite. And so their only answer was to join the witness protection program to get away from these kids. That's not where we want to be. And so I talk all the time with what's our relief plan. Respite's one thing, relief is another. We sometimes need to get out of it. And we use in the child welfare system, for example, residential care for treatment. But I always know that really is the underlying reason for that, is the need for relief for the placement. And so the child has to go somewhere. And so we need to, shore up the, the bridge. I have a caregiver, dear friend, who talks about caring for individuals with an FASD is industrial strength traffic on a domestic strength bridge. And when the bridge breaks, we blame the bridge. And it's really the traffic. And so we have to really look at how do we support that. And then the last part, and this is probably a good transition to break, but is, because we're going to start kind of with that when we come back, is the need to do some really important grief and loss work. It's the, as I said earlier, it's the FASD but, is that whatever comes after the but is grief and loss. And how do we give up what we wish this was so we can take on what it is? And systems have grief and loss. What do you think the justice system is going to do when they really embrace the concept that consequences don't work for someone with an FASD, when their whole system is based on consequences? What about addiction treatment? What are they going to do when they understand that there is a certain subset of people who need them that don't benefit from their core values? And so that means we're going to have to change some of the systems to accommodate individuals with this disability. And I believe in universal design. I believe that when we change for individuals with an FASD, that you are going to change it for the better for lots of kids. Lots of kids could benefit in school for understanding their developmental age and not their chronological age. Look how much we've benefited from curbs that are, go down when you're pulling a roller bag or you're, got a stroller. It works really well, but those were designed for wheelchairs, and we all benefit because we did it. And so what is the universal design of some of our system accommodation going to mean for us? And that's grief and loss. I did some training about a month ago, and I arrived to do the training, and I meet the secretary, the admin assistant who's sitting there, and there's a big sign on the wall, which is, to the clients, which is, if you miss your appointment, you'll be given one in 30 days. And I know how many individuals in FASD they serve in this group. That's why they're doing training. And they're telling me right off the top that they don't understand this disability. So we have to, in grief and loss, we have to give up. Boy, it would be nice if people would just, have a consequence of not getting an appointment and then show up on time for the next one. But that doesn't work with this bunch. And so what's that going to mean for the work that we do? So grief and loss tied into, that's all of those things is what caregivers need in order to feel like they can put one foot in front of the other and go. And again, I'm going to say as a parting shot before break is that many, many times it takes more than one family, one group to raise these kids. Some of them, there is a subset of them that wear everybody out, and it takes more than that. But when you're doing the training, the coaching, the respite and relief, and the grief and loss work, and still need to do that, then we have to accept that. That's sort of how it's a handoff. It takes a lot of work. Okay, so if you feel like you need to step away for a while, that's not unreasonable. Okay, time for a break.
I think that's a good time for a break. So we can come back. I have 2 different times. Maybe we'll come back at 10 to 11. Is that all right?
That sounds perfect. 10 minutes sounds great. Okay.
All right.
Thanks,
Wonderful.
Lindsay. Okay. And keep the questions and comments coming.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'm back.
Yeah, I think we're good to get going. Hopefully everyone got their coffee refilled.
Yeah, I did. So there are other questions there, Lindsay, that I can reference before we start? Comments?
So I'm gonna do questions on the second half.
Okay. Hi, Linda, you're back.
Hi. So I'm going to there are quite a few questions. So I'm gonna try to group them together as best I can, unless you just want me to do them one by one.
Sure, well, is there a
Let's
theme?
try. Yeah,
there a theme?
So I'll start with adult housing. So some of the question was, do you feel that supportive group homes for individuals with FASD works? And then the other one about adults was, will they always require support throughout their lifetime, no matter their age, if they can't manage their own money? So they kind of go together.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the start, do you think?
That's the start.
Okay, sounds good. All right, I'll talk about group care, adult support. All right, got it.
And then I have a few more that are more some things that you've already touched on, but maybe more specific to, to a parent.
Can you give me that one and I'll put that in the queue?
Sure. So the mom has a son who's almost 18, struggling with wanting independence at all costs, rejecting his diagnosis, or needing parenting help. So any tips to make her house rules work, how to help him without feeling controlled. So the example is he's smoking pot, skipping school, hanging out with trouble, spending his money, but then, being disrespectful to the nth degree, but then is the sweetest boy she knows.
Yeah, the consistent pattern of inconsistencies, which is, I mean, for those, already listening, that's crazy making, right? It's completely crazy making to have that kind of, push pull. Yeah, no, okay, I got it. All right.
And I've got lots more.
Okay, well, I want you to, I mean, I have an agenda of sorts that we want to kind of cover, but those won't be hard to cover. I want to start here with something I usually start with and didn't this morning, but I want to be really clear because this is going to it is being taped and probably being shared. And so what I want to be really clear about is that we have some practice research in FASD. We really understand what the components of placement stability look like. We've got some pretty good ideas through research about how to be supportive. But I'm going to tell you that we are lacking a lot of research in intervention about FASD, and it's coming. It's certainly better than it was 10 years ago, and it will be better in 10 years. But so we are often relying on, if research is the standard, then the next standard has got to be best practice or promising practice. And so I've talked a lot about, this seems to be best practice. And what I mean by that, just for people who are listening, is it means that if you put 20 people like me in a room, we would probably all agree that the majority of the individuals with an FASD, for example, have trouble with money. So there'd be some consensus in that group about that being an issue, and then maybe even consensus on what to do about that. So that's sort of best practice, promising practice. And then what you're also getting from me, and I'm way too old to excuse this or to, be challenged by it, but you get my bias. I've looked at this issue for a very, very long time, and I get to hear the stories of many, many people. And so I'm going to come out the other end of that, having very significant bias from, holes in both research and best practice. I have an opinion. And so you're getting some of that. So if you're wondering what's research, what's best practice, and what's bias, hopefully I've identified that as I put that out there to you, but you can certainly ask. So I didn't want to start the next half without kind of putting that out there. So that's my my best before date statement is there. The other thing I was thinking about as I was pouring myself another coffee, we've talked about the difference between sort of seeing something as a behavioral issue and something as a functional issue, something, how they're put together, how they see the world, how they feel the world. And so when we've talked about how do we, when and where are they most available for support? And those are questions we need to ask. And there's no question that sometimes we're all not available for support for a whole bunch of reasons. There's a cute viral video of a little girl, if you're on social media at all, and she's talking to her dad and she says, I've had a bad day, just leave me alone. And basically back off. And I thought I should kind of capture that for FASD work, because we sometimes come at these kids when they don't have it. They don't have it to give. And so the question about when and where are they most available for support needs to be considered. It might be in that rejecting support of the 18-year-old is it might feel intrusive and it might feel like it's not working. And when we use prevention, and this is everything about FASD is prevention. I mean, we talk about how do we prevent it in the first place? And then we talk about how do we prevent the costly cascade of adverse outcomes? How do we keep them in school and not be suspended? How do we keep them away from substances? How do we keep them well supervised? How do we? And that's the prevention work. But the question that comes with prevention is that we mostly do prevention when they're not available for support. We have to create environmental supports to prop them up when life is really hard. So those are the preambles to the really, really good questions that were asked, and I can certainly get to those, Linda, if we're ready for that. I think the premise that individuals with this disability are going to need some supports in some key areas for the rest of their life has to be understood. I am not saying that nobody with this disability ever gets to manage their own money, whatever that looks like. I'm just saying that the majority of individuals with this disability are challenged by that in many ways. They give it away, they share it, they live like a king, and then they starve for 29 days of the month. There's lots of evidence that that's really, really hard for them. And so when we take just one thing and say, okay, well, how would we support that? Then we're looking to systems for that. We have in Alberta, for example, we have a program, you have ODSP, we have AISH, and in our AISH program here, we have a support component where there can be a second party, or it can be given in not one big chunk at the beginning of the month. It's called the AISH benefit program, which means that they can accommodate the money disabilities, is that even fair to say? But the part of their disability that creates outcomes for them for this. And it works. We just have to give ourselves permission, because we see adulthood and independence as managing your own time and your own money and your own relationships and your own hygiene and your own schedules, which we all know for the most part is that many individuals with this disability are challenged by that. It's not all of them, but it's enough for us to talk about it in a forum like this. So that's how we have to consider this. So adults in support is they will need some support, and sometimes the support goes into a pattern of care where it's just kind of natural. It's just what happens, and that's the best way for it. It's just normalized. Okay. I'm gonna go to group care after I talk about 18-year-olds rejecting support. Very, very common. There's absolutely no question about the commonness of that. But it also comes from a societal belief system that this child has heard about since they entered school, where independence was the value, and accepting support, as I said earlier, indicated that you were weak or not enough of, or any of those kind of things. And so how we trade off on this is we need to do better work 18 years ago. And that's what makes it hard at 18, is that we probably, even though we tried, it probably wasn't concerted enough effort to get us where we need to go. And so at 18, when you, and please remember that at 18, we have some of the developmental dysmaturity, which is the, 13 and 14-year-old kind of pushback. You're not the boss of me. I'm going to make my own way. And it's just a hold the line kind of premise around how do we keep them engaged in supports, and what do those supports need to look like. And that's where, it doesn't matter what they think. And I know that's, boy, there's nowhere in the social work code of ethics that it says it doesn't matter what your client thinks. It certainly does. But when you have faulty logic, and we try to convince you that your thinking's off, but because your thinking's off, you can't consider that your thinking's off. We often need to stop talking and just start doing. Just support without information. And there's a very different feel when you say, I have to do this for you, because if I don't do it for you, then it's going to be a disaster. It's such a better feeling when you just do the support and you don't tell them because because it will be a disaster, if that makes sense. And so if there's a specific kind of writing it out with the things that work, is probably, and looking at your own needs around training and respite and all of those things is what we need to do. And it's really hard to start respite at 18. How do we do that? And that's why starting it at a reasonable, always probably age is the way to go, so that gets normalized, and then that's part of the action, so that everybody can regroup and get a break. So it's really hard to start these things when kids are already in adolescence. So the person that asked that question, is that at any level helpful? Is there a comment there?
There's no follow-up comment from that person, but it was also a common theme in the school setting. And the other question was, again, how do you respectfully try to help someone and still maintain a connection? So it was a common theme of, how do we help these people when they push us away? Right.
Well, you just do. They don't have to want the help. If the help isn't judgmental and it's not punishing, and there's not a, if you don't let me in, then it's going to be a disaster kind of tone, you just do it. It's just part of what happens. That's the definition of assertive outreach, is getting in front of it and doing it before they need it. It just happens, right? And I think that there's lots of practice that, because they've had experiences with people being angry at their need for needing things, they're a little sensitive to. I'm going to talk about group care here in a minute, but I had a young man that was finally reasonably housed in, kind of an adult group care experience. And he lived a kind of a rough life and could bring risk into the house. And so they decided that they needed to search him before he came in the house to make sure he didn't have any things that would create risk for the people who live there and who work there. And that's how he was approached. He was met at the door when he came home, and he was searched, and he stopped coming home, and he started being difficult. And it hadn't happened like that until they decided that the risk was there. And it took some convincing that they could actually let him in and bring him to the kitchen and serve him a cup of tea and take his jacket, and they could look at his jacket without having to be intrusive to him. So you can work around the need for safety and supervision in a lovely kind of way, without saying you need supervision and you aren't to be trusted. and you you bring risk into the family, is we can make that work in a different way. And that's hard, because you want to have a gotcha sometimes, hey, I found you out, gotcha. And that doesn't work very well. I think too, the other issue, I'm just going to move to the group care kind of experience, is that this is we have very little research, having preambled this earlier, but so it's mostly biased, but I think it's well, I have good conversations with other people who work like I do in the same area. But when you think about group care and you understand this brain, is what you have to appreciate is that they absorb the emotion of other people. They don't, if I walk into the grocery store and there's something going on, I don't walk over there and include myself in that mess. I'm quite grateful. I might even head back out to the parking lot, depending on what it is. But we learn to manage our own emotions, and I don't leave there all upset because somebody was upset. And I'm here to tell you that the experience that I've had with this disability is that many people with it absorb the emotional response of everybody around them. So when they're in a group that's upset, they're upset. When they hear a story, that story can often become theirs. So they live through the experiences of people around them. They don't look at somebody and say, that's not my experience. I don't have that. They take it on for themselves. And so when you put a lot of kids together, a lot of individuals together that have are challenged by this disability or by other issues, by trauma, by other things, these are individuals who can absorb that, which isn't necessarily the experience. I mean, we go to groups. If you think about what does groups do for us? And I don't know, let's pick a group, it doesn't matter. But you go to Weight Watchers. Okay, I'm just picking one. You go to Weight Watchers and you're going to walk into a room and you're going to have an experience that you share with everybody. And so that's probably a good start. But what also happens is you get to look around and you start to feel better instantly, because somebody there is going to weigh more than you do. Okay, so you're going to just feel better right away because you're in a group that you share something, but you feel like you're in better shape than that. I joke with a friend who used to go to a Parents of Troubled Teens group for their teen that was giving them a few runs for their money. And she used to joke saying, well, at least Simon's not as bad as this girl's parents tell she is. And so I feel better right away because our issue isn't as hard as somebody else's. And so that's the power of group. I'm mocking it a bit, but the power of group is you get to look at the group and say, I'm in better shape and I'm going to stay away from the stuff that's not working for me. And individuals with FASD can't do that. They go into groups and they absorb what's going on there. And so it's a dangerous, at some level. It can be dangerous for the experiences of some of our adults. It's certainly dangerous for some of our experiences of our kids in therapeutic environments. And so living together when there's chaos, when your brain needs stability and predictability and calm, is hard because you're going to absorb that. And so we often get, the fallout of that. I remember, just to give you a group care experience, I was called in once with a group home because they were spending a lot of money on overtime for their staff because their kids weren't going to sleep until early hours of the morning. And so their, night staff who used to come on at 11 could never be left alone because there was too much chaos going on. And when we looked at that, and this is the earlier conversation I have about the developmental trajectory of FASD, is let's look at what we know about kids that are between the 11, these kids were all between 11 and 14, I think. And what you know about them is they have dysmaturity for the most part. They 5 of the 6 of them had an FASD diagnosis. So we knew that. The other thing we knew is that sleep is hard. Getting them to sleep is hard, keeping them asleep is hard, and getting them up in the morning is hard. So how are we going to accommodate their disability within the expectations of this group care experience? And so my conversation with them, which didn't go well initially and then went really well, was you can't do what you're doing in the evening. If you meet toddlers, parents of toddlers, you know that everything after dinner is centered on getting them to bed. So we have a bath and we have a story, and you're not wrestling and running them around the house. You're cooling their jets. You're getting them to bed, and everything is focused on that. And if you don't do that, you run around the community and you do a whole bunch of things. They're not settling when they get home, and you know they're not. And then you're going to be in for something in the morning. So my conversation with this group home was these kids were absorbing the chaos of each other, because they were doing all what I just described. They were taking the kids to hockey games, and they're outside, and they're going shopping, and they're doing this and they're doing that. And then they were coming home at 9 o'clock and throwing them into bed and thinking, okay, they're going to go to sleep, where they needed a lot of lead time. And then the chaos of building into that programming is creating all kinds of issues. And so the grief and loss of the staff of this group care environment was, but what do you want us to do after supper then? Like, if we can't do activities, and so we described what those activities would look like. Those were, a board game, if they weren't too excited about the outcomes of those kind of things, but a story, soft music. I don't know. I was asking them to come up with it. I don't know these kids. But the reality is that they couldn't do what they were doing because they would continue to have the fallout of that, because these kids absorb all of what's going on. If that makes any sense at all. Okay, makes sense. Any other questions, Linda?
I do have one comment from a parent and then a few other questions. So I'm an older mom with younger kids with FASD, and a stable placement is important. But talking into the future, talking about money management, housing, this is where she panics. And she questions her placement stability because of her age for the future of her kids.
Right. It's a really good question, and it's kind of prickly for most of us. I mean, we talk about, I just did a consultation with it was a 4-year-old boy, and he's with a 72-year-old grandma, right? And it seems like, and he's been there since birth, and he's 4. And what I know is that when the kids are going to need him, the child is going to need the grandma the most, she's going to be unavailable to that child, right? So you go 4 and you go 10 years, and she's 84 and the child's 14. And then the next 10 years from 14 to 24 aren't going to get easier. This 14-year-old's not contributing to the life in many deliberate ways to the to the experience of that grandmother. In other words, might not reliably shovel the walks, might not reliably go for groceries, might not reliably do a lot of things. And so the trajectory is hard. And that is the conversation we need to have, is that we have it for pets, for goodness sake. I just have a friend who's said, I don't think I can get another dog. Her dog just passed away. And she said, I don't think I can get another one because I don't think I can commit to the next 15 years, right? So if we're doing that for pets, why can't we do that for human beings when we know what the load is? So here's what I'll also say. So those are making the decision kind of statements, which I said to this child welfare worker at the time. But when the kids are already in your placement, then you need a small army of people around you that can pinch hit and step in and be part of their lives when you no longer can. And that conversation, absolutely, don't panic it. You have to, it's a predictable trajectory of development with FASD. And as expectations increase and skills don't, there's going to be more and more room for the need for support. And unless the diagnosis is wrong, which I'm not suggesting it is, and I'm not, then what it means is that they're going to continue to need you. And if it can't be you, then it has to be somebody else. And so you build that in early, so that needs to be there. The interesting sidebar story to this 4-year-old grandma was that she also brought her daughter in that was going to be her backup singer. So when I suggested, why doesn't the youngster go move with the daughter now, and grandma can be grandma, and we could get that going, the daughter turned to the worker. The worker fell apart because the daughter said, well, I'm not raising him. I'll be here to support, but I'm not raising him. So the plan had huge holes in it. In other words, I'll be there in a crisis, but I'm not raising him. And so we have to be really clear about who's going to have, and that's the focus has to be on, how do we keep this child where they are? And when they're already there, then we have to work around the variables that are there. Does that make sense? So don't panic, but just be mindful, right? We can grow them up. We absolutely can. That developmental trajectory of, how far behind are they? And that's why we need good assessment, has to be believed, and they don't catch up. It's not like they're going to have a moment of clarity at 14 and say, okay, now I'm with the program. As expectations increase, they have a really hard time, meeting those expectations without support. Okay. Makes sense?
I have a lot of that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay.
So that's awesome. So now there's a couple of questions that are sort of specific to just whether or not about that alcohol is a toxin, but what about exposure to hard drugs such as cocaine or heroin? Can they have some similar effects?
Well, I mean, here's the issue, probably in Canada and most of North America, is that prenatally, women using substance in pregnancy will use what's available. So there's often a poly-use profile that if you don't do a good prenatal alcohol history and really do a good job of getting the information and getting it from healthcare and from justice and from systems around the mom and from her, is that you might be missing it. You might think it's just been about drugs when it's also been about alcohol. My experience with this is that there's often a poly-use profile. So they're using many things. They end up, using alcohol, they're using drugs, they have insecure housing, they have poor nutrition, they have prenatal care, they smoke. All of those things impact the developing fetal brain. And so it's never a clear picture. The only clear picture you ever get is when you're using rats in a lab and giving them very measured amounts of alcohol and saying, well, how do they function when they're born? Human beings don't manage life that way. And so what we do know, this is the science, is that alcohol causes way more damage than drugs, but drugs cause damage. Smoking causes damage. Tobacco causes damage in terms of, how much and when and to who and what else is also very hard. So that question probably could take a 4-hour conversation. So I'm just, giving you the flashcards here.
And I think the last one that will kind of catch us up, somebody is saying, hi, Donna. I don't know if I'm pronouncing their name right, Zenaid. Can you talk a little bit about how children with FASD learn, especially if we are working on language learning and receptive language in speech therapy settings?
Right. Well, I'm not a speech therapist, so I'm not even going to pretend I would know how to do that. When you sound more capable than you are, which was the interesting tongue-in-cheek point that I sometimes make about speech therapy, is that we often measure when kids have articulation problems. So when we can't understand them, we get really excited and we offer service, but we often don't measure, do they understand us? And that's the, receptive language piece. So expressive gets our attention, receptive, we go, not so sure. How we work on that, I trust the learned skill set of speech therapists to say, how do we make gains in this area? I think anecdotally, and how families got to work, is that it's just practice, rehearse, practice, rehearse, practice, rehearse. And so we make language, we read to them, we use words, and we help them in processing. And we understand that it's part of their disability and that they will misunderstand. And so how do we check for comprehension? And do we need to check for comprehension? Because sometimes we ask them questions like, do you understand me? And they always say they do. So I'm not sure how informed we are after some of those questions. And so it's based on performance. Are they able to, meet expectations with language-based prompts? Is absolutely going to be part of good assessment.
Donna, this is Zainab. Can I just ask a quick follow-up? I'm actually a speech and language pathologist. I found your
Okay.
I found this very, very helpful. I guess I'm wondering, especially for a few of my clients who have been exposed to drugs in utero and alcohol. I think my question was specifically when we have established that there is a receptive language delay or expressive for my children who are just late talkers, who wouldn't have that profile. We do a lot of, indirect teaching. We do a lot of modeling where they're then just sort of expected that, okay, with a lot of exposure, they will eventually pick up the language models that I'm trying to teach them, whether it be, I'm a preschool speech pathologist, so I'm working on those like early language, like pronouns or, ing endings, stuff like that. So would my take on therapy be different with these kids with this profile because their learning is different? So I guess my question was specific to, should I be changing the way I'm doing therapy and make it more scaffolded and more direct, or should it be play-based, informal, as we do with other kiddos that are this age and obviously late talking because of their profile?
Well, and I would get back to, what's the purpose? Why are they here? And so I think you're probably going to do a little of both of those things, right? How do I keep their attention? How do I keep them working? It's going to be a 24/7, as most speech is, experience. So you're probably spending as much time with caregivers, right, on how to be supportive to these kids as you are with the child themselves. Does that make sense?
Yes,
So
that does. So a lot of parent training, I'm guessing.
Lots of parent training. And then we have to also, I think, understand that their language skill set is a lifelong issue. And so what do we need them to know now? What do we need them to have? What's important? What hill are we going to die on, for lack of a better descriptor? And so I think you'll be picking and choosing what's important to the child's functioning and what's important to the family's functioning in terms of what kind of therapy you're offering. Does that make sense? So pronouns might be important, but maybe they're not, is what I'm trying to say. And not being a speech therapist, I'm not that familiar with the curriculum that you use, but I do understand the fact that they misunderstand.
Yeah, I think that was an example, but it helps to know that I think, as always, setting functional goals and maybe just working on that overall communication. I am starting with a family next week, so this was very, very helpful as to how I can support that little one, especially in the zone of their development.
And I think that I would start with the parents to say, what would make life easier for you? What skill sets do they need, and how can I be helpful here? And the other part, of course, it's really important is that, when kids have poor articulation, I kind of, this isn't going to come off right, but I'm kind of more pleased, because then we don't assume they understand, right? And then they get words and they get language and articulation, then we assume they understand. And so sometimes kids get the right amount of attention when we can't understand them. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
So sometimes we fix something and then we're sorry we did, sort of. Thank you for that question. That was great.
And Donna, I missed one. I do have one more, if we can
Yeah.
So coming from a school setting, we are often speculating whether a child may have FASD. How can we get a diagnosis, supports in place while we are unsure of family history? Often a difficult conversation to have with families. It is often difficult to get the support of professionals outside agency without documentation to support diagnosis.
That's been the conversations that I've had with people since 1990, right? Is, what's the value of suspected FASD? How do we, and there's so many, sort of that there's such poor information out there about what it has to look like. At least we've moved away from they've got to be small and they've got eye problems and they got like we've moved away from the physical presentation. I just saw produced in 2023 BritBox series. I don't remember the name of it. And somebody, I won't get into the details of this, but the main kind of character that they're all trying to solve the crime around is somebody with an FASD. And I was, screaming at the TV because of the, because of the stereotypes that kind of came with that. So when we're looking at identification and we're looking at sort of putting risk forward for assessment, I think we have to remember that that's a multi-stage process. It's not a one and done. It's not a ask and answered. I think that one of the best questions to go to caregiving is, your child has strengths, of course. Let's talk about those. Those are wonderful. But what makes you concerned about your child? What's your explanation for the problems your child is having? And listen for the answers. And I think that gives us a window. Schools are asked to do so much. They're not diagnosticians. They're not even sometimes in a position to refer for diagnosis. And so the idea that they're left holding the bag when they have no ability to go looking for the, for the answers is also hard. But here's what I'm going to say about that, and this is complete bias, is that there's nothing in professional ethics that says, well, there is something in professional ethics that says you've diagnosed the child yourself when you have no ability to do that. So there's no way in the in your notes or your CUME record or anything that you can say that you think this is going on. But you can point to the fact that you think this child thinks differently, learns differently, and might need to be accommodated for that. And then describe a pattern of intervention that comes from best practice of FASD. And meanwhile, so in other words, we don't have to wait for diagnosis to try a different approach, is what I'm trying to say. We often do that. Well, we don't have any diagnosis, so we're just going to treat this child typically. One of the things that saddens me the most in my work are kids that actually have had a diagnosis. And when I ask the question, so what did that mean for the child's developmental trajectory? What did you do because they had the diagnosis? And the answer is clearly nothing. So the diagnosis of FASD was ignored. So we have two issues. When we diagnose them, it gets often ignored. And when we don't diagnose, then we have kind of a mystery application. But most people arrive at managing these kids within the context of improved intervention because they've had failure in other areas. No question about that. But it's really hard for systems to take that on. Really hard. Okay.
I think that's it for questions.
Okay, all right. I want to talk a little bit about how do we work together? How do we share a perspective? And so I'm a huge fan of the whole power of consultation. Let's come together. Let's talk about how do we do this? What does this actually look like? So I'm going to do something very fancy here, and I'm going to share a screen, and it's here. I did it, I think. All right. So when we talk about FASD informed practice, and this is a bit of a summary, and I'm happy to share these with anybody. You don't need to scribble down the stuff. I will get these to Lindsay and Linda, and they can get them to you. But when we talk about intervention supports, it needs these things. It needs to be carefully planned. And so, when you're worried about what's coming, you need to approach that, not with worry, but with a conscious, planful kind of effort and with a take charge kind of approach. It needs to be strategic. In other words, what's the intended outcome you hope to get? And so in consultation, when I'm kind of leading the way with this, I'll say, what would make this a good outcome at age 18? For the mom that was asking me about the, rejecting support of the 18-year-old, I'd say, what do you want at 25 and how are we going to get there? And if you want him connected with your family and you're still available to lend him $20, and he's still coming for Thanksgiving dinner, then we have to have a measured approach to what that's actually going to look like. So what is the intended outcome that you hope to get? Needs to be carefully considered. We need to anticipate challenges, so and associated risks. So I don't know how to say this other than how I'm going to say it, which is don't teach them things you don't want them to know. I was part of a consultation recently and with a child who has great developmental dysmaturity, and they were talking about, because he's 15 or 16 and eventually going to live on his own, he needs to learn how to use a bank card. And maybe not. Let's really look at what we're teaching here. I'm not saying no, I'm just saying let's look at what are the challenges that exist and what is the associated risk with teaching them something. So that's anticipating what's coming. This is the exhausting part of being a caregiver or a person in the life of someone with an FASD, is you're always having to anticipate what's coming. People do that with physical disabilities all the time. Is there a ramp? Is there an elevator? Can I get into the building? Is there a place I can go? So this is what we're talking about here, is we're just anticipating what's coming. Now, don't go too far, but you need to go far enough to manage the vulnerabilities. We need the informed practice to be risk minimizing. So this requires structure and consistency and a thinking-free kind of environment. And we also need, in the heat of the moment, kind of understanding. What do I mean by that? Well, it's fine for me to have the information and it's fine for your coaches to have the information, but in the heat of the moment, you need the information. And you need to know how to respond when the kid says no. And you need to know what to respond when, when a bedroom is trashed. And so we need to support with all of that, anticipating and carefully planned and risk minimizing. We need to have answers in the heat of the moment. I'm just going to give you the bottom line with something, is that you can postpone, which many times with kids you shouldn't do, but you can postpone dealing with things later for these kids. You don't have to deal with everything in the moment. And sometimes when you choose to react to everything in the moment, you're actually responding to nothing. Everything gets to be the priority, then nothing's the priority. And so that's the helpfulness of case consultation and support, is we can talk about in the heat of the moment kind of stuff. And of course, practice needs to be, safe for everyone to be part of it. Okay, so how do we do this? It says, outcomes for children. Obviously, I didn't change the slide. If it was an adult, I could use the same slide, but it means we have to find them early, right? The earlier we talk about early intervention and creating those habits and having an improved explanation for what's going on, doesn't mean when you have the explanation later that you can't, kind of go backwards and say, well, this made some sense and how do we change direction here? That happens for school many, many times. I just had a young, they finally figured it out. I think she was grade 6, end of 5, beginning of 6, finally had a diagnosis of FASD. Before that, had no information. We're treating her as an aggressive, assaultive, verbally aggressive, verbally assaultive kid who was in trouble every day, suspended, expelled, deported. And finally, we have an explanation for why life has been hard for her and for everybody around her. And we had to explain her then. We had to go backwards to change our mind about why she was falling apart every day. And that took some really important work, is how do we have a re-explanation after we have later identification. And then that makes for service planning and training to people, and focus on increased placement stability. And I left the term secondary disabilities in here. I left it for a reason. For those of you who've had training many years ago, I wanted you to know that although Anne Streiskuth's research from 1996 still has unbelievable validity, we don't call it secondary disabilities, we call them adverse outcomes now. We want the child to not have adverse outcomes. And what we mean by that is placement instability, schools that don't understand, and we have suspensions, and we have replacements, and we're looking for a program. I had a principal call me a couple of weeks ago who said, did I know of any programs for a young boy in his school that had an FASD? And I said to him, I do. And he said, oh, good, good, good. He said, where is it? What is it? And I said, it's your school. he got all upset with, what do you mean my school? I said, yeah, you can do this. You can be what he needs. And so the idea that we have specialized service delivery to avoid adverse outcomes doesn't necessarily need to be there. And then we have effective transition to adult services. We understand what that's going to look like, and we bring people along. I don't know why we arbitrarily called it 18. I think that could be a problem for some of our kids, but the truth is we need to be thinking about that for a long time. What I can warn against, and I don't know if this makes sense to you, but there's no getting them ready to be an adult. There's no, I have a 14-year-old grandson, and I'm telling you that every once in a while his mom says, he needs to take more responsibility, and I'm getting him ready. What kind of 18 or 20-year-old is he going to be? And that might make sense because he has a brain that's reliable to him, and he's got it. But for kids with this disability, there's no way to put a foot in their back and push them. In the child welfare population, I often hear people saying, they've got 15 and 16, 17-year-olds with FASD who've run out of resources in the typical programming, and they've put them into independent living. And I almost refuse to get involved in those kind of situations, because the placement of independence for a person with the 15 or 16-year-old with FASD is absolutely ridiculous. It has absolutely no value and is not going to work for them. So when we look at promising practice, we have to look at it from can we find them? What does that mean? What do we do? Where is this going? So that's kind of the simplicity of this slide. And then I want to talk about, and this is kind of a summary and a jump off point, and I'm hoping there's some questions and comments that come from these, there's 6 slides here, but everything about FASD is prevention is certainly what it says, and you can read. And when you look at this from a primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention point of view, and primary means what does everybody need? Secondary prevention is what do most people need? And what is tertiary prevention is what do some people need? So what does everybody with an FASD need is they need placement stability. And we need to address the risk factors for disruption. So I just want to stop here just for a moment and give you some of the, what do I mean by that? Is that we have to really look at the placement, the school placement, the home placement, if it's a, work placement. How do we know that everyone's coping? Well, nobody's denying or minimizing. Everybody's kind of got a realistic view of this. People are seeking information. Okay. Those of you on the call this morning, if you're caregiving, you're always seeking information. That's how we support, or not support, but that's how we minimize the risk to burnout. You're learning to provide your own care. And so when you understand the whole thing is about you, and that it's the environment that predicts the outcomes here, then we have to take into consideration that there may be things you need so that can happen. You set limits, you recruit support, you find people in your life that understand FASD. So if you've got a sister-in-law or you've got a colleague that says, you just tough love, you just got to let these kids fall apart, because if they fall apart, they're going to learn. And if they don't fall apart, they're never going to learn. then you know not to go to them for support. They're not going to be helpful to you, okay, at any level. We're anticipating where things are going. We're gaining a manageable perspective. I'm going to tell you that the families that I see coping the best have a really good sense of humor about the outcomes of FASD, and they help their kids see that not everything is awful. You know, I'm dealing with my 91-year-old mother, who I picked her up for her hearing aid appointment the other day, and she thought she was going to the dentist, which clearly, after I dropped her off at the hearing aid appointment, should have been clear. But she went to the hearing aid appointment without her hearing aids because she thought she was going to the dentist. Now, she was in tears, upset, and I know this isn't FASD, but this is the same stuff. And I had to make her laugh about that. That was hilariously funny at 91 with unreliable memory and poor organization. And so families that can see not everything as crisis, that some things are terribly funny, tend to do better. And those are reducing the risk factors for placements not working out. And so what I also want you to appreciate is that these risk factors for placement disruption really is a three-pronged plug. There's three pieces to this that are critically important. And I can give these as notes to you. I can pull them up for Linda and Lindsay so they can be part of this PowerPoint presentation. But you know, one of the prongs, of course, is the child, and there's all of it, you know, the sexual acting out, the physical aggression, you know, stealing, defiance, some of the mental health stuff around suicide, ideation, and it's wearing, it's really hard. One of the major issues affecting placement stability is the child's sense that they're too much, right? That they feel burdening, and that creates a decreased level of attachment. And do you remember that, you know, connection, compliance, competency is if the family is, you know, working from, you know, connection to compliance on a regular basis with the individual with this disability, and saying things like that, you know, if you wanted to live here, you wouldn't steal from us, and if you loved us, you wouldn't do this, and if we were important to you, this wouldn't happen. What happens over time is there's a decreased sense that the child feels like they belong, that they're part of that they might feel that they're too much. So that's one of the prongs. The other obvious prong in sort of placement stuff is the family and the parents, and there's like 4 points that I make here, which is one of them is the family doesn't have good enough information about the neurodevelopmental disorder, and so they have unrealistic expectations, and that can be catastrophic to placement for sure. When you're expecting the child to do this, and this is all they can do, and you actually probably have assessment to tell you that, but this is where you need it to be. Again, lots of room for people to be upset. The other issue with families around that is that you have absent or inappropriately delivered support services. So you have someone coming in, or as somebody said earlier, telling you that you're enabling and you're doing too much and you're doing that. That's a risk factor for disruption, right? Because you're going to come out of that, you know, knowing that that's probably poor advice, that's not working. Some of those, when services use some of those words that I was using earlier that I don't like, that he's enabling and he's, you know, manipulating and he's unmotivated, you're going to know that service delivery continuum isn't going to be servicing for you. And then the third one, which sounds weird, but it's absolutely there, is families and systems that put the run on the help. And what I mean by that is that, and I'd be on a beach today if I got $1 for every time this happens for me, but is that, you know, people work really hard to get service and then don't use it. You know, I had too long ago had an experience with a family that, you know, wanted my service and worked really hard with their agency to contract with me. And then I called and said, oh, good news, we've got some time approved, and they had everything. They had family coming, they had Friday coming, they had a hairdresser appointment, they just couldn't put it together, and that's putting the run on the help. And I think there's a real reason for that sometimes, which is it requires change, and it requires hard work to change your mind about how to be helpful. And so sometimes when you put the run on the help, it's sort of preserving, and I often get to hear it from the point of view is, I know they have FASD, Donna, but they did this last week or they did that last week. And as I've said already too, that's coming from the grief and loss perspective. So there's always a good reason. That's not anything more than sort of self-preservation. And then the other risk factor for placement and a risk factor for disruption is unrealistic expectations. And so, how do we create a realistic view of what's in front of you? What's a good outcome? I'll say often to families, what does this look like at 18? What do you think this is about? And hopes and dreams are fine, but a realistic application to what you think that would be really serves us well. I joke with my husband that, we've been married, 45 years. And I said, he's exceeded expectations, and so I don't know what they were, but he's exceeded them. He's quite pleased with that. So I think it serves us well to do that. The third prong in this plug is service providers. And what do we do to sabotage? Well, most of the research about this has come from the child welfare system, and most of my experience is that it's shared, which is we have a significant fragmentation of service. We have information that gets lost. We have, many, many files of some of these really hard kids, and nobody's read the first 11 volumes. They're just working off the last contact note, and then that's the whole story. So our idea of learning the story of someone with an FASD is critically important. How did they come on this? What was their prenatal experience? How did they arrive on this planet? What happened to them? Where were we with assessment, diagnosis, expectation, placement stability? Their story is really important, and systems seem to not remember that. And we deal with the last crisis, and crisis management seems to take over. There's also like multiple caregivers and multiple experiences. We can have agencies. I can have an agency where I'm doing some work in September and I have one caseworker, and by November I have another one, and then the acting supervisor is taking over, and then there's somebody else in February. And that's a risk factor for placement disruption because there's not a consistent application of best practice here for anybody. And then the other part is the wide variation, and I'm going to say this in a couple of different ways, between information we have and what everybody knows. So when I work in the adult system, because we have privacy and we have, public policy about how we share information and how information gets shared, is what happens in the adult world is their childhood experience doesn't make its way to the adult world. And there's lots of good assessment and there's good information, and it doesn't make itself there. Individuals with this disability have a really hard time telling their story and knowing what's happened to them and what experiences and information is out there. So they are not sharing. So there's a real difference between what we should know and what we actually have. And that's a risk factor for stability as well. And so how do we create information transfer, and how do we get information that's important to have legs? That's the beauty of placement stability, because if a child lives somewhere all the way through childhood and now needs adult service, which we are assuming at some level, they may need a little or a lot, is that at least there's somebody there to remind everybody about the story. And that is a protective factor. And that's why placement stability is so important. Somebody knows that child or that adult really well to say, this is how they learn the best. These are the risks. This is what we've learned. And that's risk factors for development. So when we talk about placement stability having a major part, and I'm talking about placement, but that also works for school. How do we look at what's going to end the school placement? How is this kid going to get kicked out? What's going to happen? Because once we say those words out loud, we know how to prevent. We know what gets to be important. Okay. So the other part in primary prevention is we want to make sure that they don't have those experiences I just described. We don't have adverse outcome development. And when we do, I just had a foster parent that I've had in training a couple times call me the other day to say that her young person is stealing. And I said, don't fall apart. Did you not expect that there'd be some ownership stuff? And she's, I did. And I said, what are you going to do about it? And we talked about that. And so we don't need to fall apart when things happen. Some things are really predictable. And that's not the end of the world. And it doesn't mean it has to go forward. It doesn't mean that that's that child's character and that's what's going to happen going forward. Okay. Secondary prevention, which many, people with this disability, we have to pay attention to, is the dysmaturity, the functional fallout, the emotional dysregulation, some of the adverse outcomes beginning to be present. And when we have tertiary, and I get involved in many of those cases where everything that could have gone wrong did. And now we've got a child who's, had multiple placements, has experiences with substances we wish they didn't have. They don't have a useful school program or a useful day in terms of employment. We have youth criminal justice or other justice involvement. All of those are there. And we have to then say, well, how do we turn this around? How do we create a better outcome for these individuals? And we have to do that work too. Now, many of those experiences in tertiary prevention might have been handled if we had understood the needs for some of that primary prevention. Placement stability, the really understanding brain versus, in terms of function, and some of the adverse outcome development could have been supported. How do we give them a good day? Okay, making sense? That was a long one. So here's the principles of practice. And again, we're going to come back to your questions and your comments, but we want consistency in placement of relationship and approach. It's not okay for, I have a cartoon. I don't know if I put it in here. I don't think I did. Oh yeah, there it is. We all line up. And you can do it anything you like, but you've got the guy with the gun who's starting the race, but you've got the family, you've got the school, you've got service providers, you can put anybody on the line. And the race starts and the gun goes off and everybody takes off their own way. Right? And this is useless. When the school's doing what they do and they're focusing on what they think is important, and the family's doing what they do and they focusing on what they think is important, and so does community service providers, we have to share in this in a really important way, or we're never going to get where we need to go. And so looking at this from a case management perspective is that if we're not consistent and we don't share in that, and that means some of us have to give up what we wish this was, so we can support the family or the school or the program, because we have to decide what the priorities of support are. The other principle of practice is the delicate dance, I say, between dependency and complete independency, making getting help a good thing. We need to talk that we get help. We need to show them that the world gets help and that getting help is a good thing. I could go on and on. I could do a 3-hour on how do we do this, but the truly, sort of fundamental pieces of this start very young. We celebrate their need for support. And we don't only high five when they tie their own shoes or do their own stuff. That's worth paying attention to. You can say good job, but it's not the only job. Getting help is a really good thing. And then collaboration is, how do we have truly integrated systems of responding from grassroots to policy development? And sometimes our policies, school policies, children's services policies, agency policies, are not in line with truly integrated systems of responding. And so, it was a very cheesy example, but when the agency that I do support with in Edmonton decided, yes, they could buy coffee and yes, they could drive them somewhere, their level of engagement and collaboration with their air quotes, customers improved significantly. they thought they were enabling if they did it any other way. And so that needed to come through good training and good support. And we need to anticipate rather than respond. I don't know how many times this morning I need to say that if you're crisis managing, that's all you're ever going to do. So we have to get out of that mindset. And in fact, I probably drive people crazy because they always want to problem solve with me a crisis. And I always want to say, well, how do we not have one? I don't even want to talk about this. How do we get in front of it? Because that's a principle of practice. Okay. Just some summary of what we're doing. And I really do want to make sure that I don't think we're leaving much time here, but all of this, I'm trying to see on here if there's anything I didn't say. How do we, I mean, again, a key theme for me always is how do we foster healthy dependence? But it really needs to be part of the anticipating problems and challenges in the snowplow metaphor. How do we get in front of this? And, key practice stuff is advocacy, and choices should be concrete and clear with planned outcomes. We drive these kids crazy with all of the choices that require good thinking and good outcome. And I'm not sure that that's often helpful. There's huge vulnerabilities with sexual health and placement and the rest of it. So I just threw some stuff at you here. But when we look at observing challenges through observing function, we have to really then pay attention to, what triggers the challenges. And I'm going to suggest to you that most of them are environmentally kind of supported or understood. What can we do there? How do we best structure the environment? How do we identify core beliefs that support the individual? And how do we communicate those? And I think it's a really hard time. I think a couple of questions about how do I convince the school? How do I convince the caseworker? How do I convince the people around them to come along with the thinking that could work? And that's really hard. Okay. And I've done the rest. There we go.
Thank you, Donna. I could listen to you speak all day.
Well, it's a ramble. It's a ramble. And all my pages of make sure you say this are still sitting here. So,
well, you said a lot in any event. I'm just going to put up a poll about today's session, and Linda will take it out for the day.
So I just wanted to say that, oh, there's the poll.
Okay,
last time I ended it on Lindsay, so I'm not going to press that button. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. On behalf of Contact Brant, Lindsay, and myself, I want to thank Donna for sharing her expertise on working with and supporting individuals with FASD. You provided us with a ton of information, and hopefully this helps shift our thinking about FASD and how we support our clients and our loved ones. So I especially appreciate the focus on collaboration. Also, FASD is disability of thinking, and I think we always need to think brain first as we provide support. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us, parents, community partners, far and wide. Your attendance is key to increasing FASD awareness in our communities. I'll end on a few reminders. Recording available. Lindsay will send that out, as she said. And lastly, if you had any specific questions for either myself, Lindsay, and Donna that we can pass on, our emails were in the chat box. So thanks again, Donna, for joining us. And I don't know if you have any closing words.
My only closing words is they need us, and the answers for them are with us. And I know that's a burden, but I feel grateful every day that people gave up 3 hours this morning to do this, and we'll take some things forward to consider, and all of that's going to be helpful and useful. It's going to take all of us. So I'm grateful to everybody who attended. Thank you for coming.
And there are so many nice comments. I think we'll sort of do a snapshot of that. And then if there are any questions we missed, we can also consult with you and pass it along.
I'm happy to answer any questions. I don't want to leave anybody hanging with something that they wanted an answer to and didn't get today, I'm happy to respond. I have time for that, so I'd be happy to do it. Okay,
I'm not sure that I see anything.
all right.
Okay,
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay and Linda, for organizing this. This is no small work, so thank you for that as well. You're doing
You're
great
welcome.
work in Brant.
thanks.
Thank you, Donna. Always a
Okay.
pleasure.
Bye-bye.
So
Thank you
again,
very
that's it,
much.
everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.